With his vision blurred and breath faltering, the protagonist glances down, seeing only red, the blood staining the earth and the blade lodged in his chest. With a pained voice, he murmurs to himself, wondering why there had to be so much blood, why everything had ended in such silence. As his gaze drifts over the battlefield, the full horror unfolds. His brother, Gamon, is dead, along with his closest friends, allies, and disciples. Every last one of them lies fallen in this desolate place. They had been the alliance of 20 sects, the most powerful warriors assembled for one final battle against Chinama. And yet, in the end, both sides faced annihilation. At the heart of this devastation sat the figure responsible, a demon who had descended from the heavens to bathe the land in blood, the infamous leader of the demonic cult, Chinama. With a mocking tone, Chinama addresses him, calling him disciple of Manhwa and pitying his fate. The protagonist, trembling and battered, glares at the demon as he struggles to his feet, blood trickling from his mouth. Chinama, undeterred, remarks that even if the protagonist has survived this battle, the life of glory and honor he dreamed of will be impossible. Both men know that their time has come to an end. Shut up, the protagonist spits out, fury burning in his eyes. But from atop his pile of slain enemies, Chinama reaches out and declares that the disciple can at least take pride in his final act. Though many had fought in this climactic clash, it was the protagonist's blade that delivered the final blow. Recognizing the power of Manhwa's swordsmanship, Chinama calls it the strongest on earth. The protagonist's anger boils over. "Shut up!" he shouts, launching himself forward with his sword raised. Chinama only sighs and murmurs that it's a shame. One more day, and the disciple would have been truly worthy of the name Chinama. But this, he says, is only the beginning. He warns the disciple that one day the demonic cult will return and the world will fall under its control. The disciple's sword flashes, and with a single slash, a line appears on Chinama's neck. The demon's head falls, rolling down the pile of bodies as his form dissolves into nothingness. Standing alone atop the battlefield, the protagonist whispers that the war is finally over. Yet, he knows the truth. His own life, too, has come to an end. Looking around at the desolate field, he wonders what will become of Manhwa now. Every skilled warrior of the sect has perished, leaving only children who barely know the art of the sword. The bloodshed had been monumental, but he questions if any of it was worth it. Would training harder have allowed him to save at least one of his comrades? But those thoughts now belong to a past that no longer matters. Lingering atop the mountain of corpses, he speaks to the emptiness, realizing that in the end, it was all in vain. This warrior, the 13th disciple of Manhwa and Earth's most powerful swordsman, known as the Master of the Blossoming Blade, Chong Mayang, had indeed ended the life of the demon who terrorized the land. Yet his victory would go uncelebrated, lost in this final, lonely sacrifice atop the mountain of bodies. A scene from the past flickers before his mind's eye, a baby abandoned at the foot of Mount Hua, discovered by two elderly figures who took him in. Time shifts, and he recalls himself practicing swordsmanship under the sun, his teacher calling out his name, Chan Wang. His consciousness stirs as he wrestles with these strange visions, faint memories from a distant life. The teacher's voice scolds him again, urging him to walk the righteous path of martial arts and to abandon violence. It was advice that always stung, for he often found himself reprimanded, unable to embody the virtues of the sect fully. In truth, he had always struggled with the teachings, never truly internalizing the discipline of Mount Hua, even after earning the title of Swordmaster. He realizes now that he owes everything he is to Mount Hua. A voice, one of the sect's elder masters perhaps, asks him if he has any regrets. Deep within his own consciousness, Chang Mayang admits softly, yes, too many to count. The regrets weighed heavily on him. Perhaps, if he had embraced their philosophy more deeply, he could have become an even greater warrior, one capable of changing the fate of this terrible battle. Yet in the midst of his guilt, Jamon's voice echoed, reassuring him. Jamon told him that regrets were unnecessary because everything that had happened was destined for Mount Hua. He believed that, somehow, their legacy would endure. The scene shifts suddenly to a bustling tent, where a young boy yelps in surprise as someone smacks him on the head. Confused, he defends himself, demanding to know where Chama is. But his assailant, brandishing a wooden stick, the boy, completely bewildered, retorts that he doesn't know who Chinama is and insists he's just a stinking street rat. Accusations and insults fly as the boy, still dazed, tries to make sense of his surroundings and the stranger threatening him. In desperation, the boy tells his attacker to put down the stick unless he wants a beating, but his words are met with laughter. Exasperated, the boy on the ground warns that even the leader of the beggar sect wouldn't dare treat him this way. Growing impatient, he raises his arm to strike back, but something feels wrong. He notices with surprise that his arm looks smaller, and before he can react, the stick crashes down on him once again, leaving him with a throbbing headache. His attacker mocks him, calling him shameless, and begins a relentless beating. Another bystander, who had considered intervening, backs away upon witnessing the scene, leaving the boy to his fate. Later, the boy sits by a quiet river, nursing his bleeding nose. He reflects bitterly, mumbling to himself that even at Manhwa he'd never taken such a beating. His thoughts drift to revenge, vowing to make that bastard pay someday. Yet, as he stares down into the river, he is startled by the face reflected back at him, a young child's. A thought flashes in his mind. Could this be a reincarnation, like the stories Buddhists tell? Suddenly, someone approaches him from behind. Startled, the boy calls out, and Chang Mayang turns to find a young boy standing there, the same boy who'd watched him struggle and then fled from the tent. Apologetic, the boy says that sometimes woe can be rough, but today he went too far. Chang Mayang, growing more curious, raises a finger and says he has a question. Actually, he decides 2 questions. The 2 boys face each other, an awkward silence lingering in the air. Chang Mayang, struggling to contain his frustration, asks, "Am I a beggar?" The boy coughs. "Isn't it obvious?" Chang Mayang crouches down in frustration, cursing his strange fate. Rising with a deep breath, he moves to his second question, leaning closer and asking if the boy has heard of Chinama. The boy stares at him, looking as if Chang Mayang has lost his mind. With a shake of his head, he mutters that perhaps the beating affected him more than he thought. Chang Mayang insists, demanding a clear answer. With a shrug, the boy finally replies that, yes, he knows the name. According to legend, Chinama was the great leader of the demonic clan, one who died 100 years ago. A wave of shock grips Chang Mayang. He seizes the boy by the collar, his voice trembling, and demands if this tale could really be a century old. The boy, startled and hesitant, assures him it's true and asks why he'd lie about such a thing. Releasing his grip, Chang Mayang stares in disbelief. 100 years had passed since his own death. Disheartened, Chang Mayang turns away, lost in thought, when the boy asks if he's all right. In that moment, a spark of determination rekindles within him. Urgently, he asks what happened to the sect. The boy, puzzled, stares back. "Manhwa, what's that?" he asks. Chang Mayang feels his chest tighten, an alarm rising within him. He turns to the boy, desperate for clarity. "You're a beggar, aren't you?" The boy nods, answering that he is indeed. Chang Mayang's frustration grows. "Then, as a beggar, you should belong to the Gai Bang sect. So how is it that you've never even heard of Manhwa?" The boy lists off the 10 great sects of the world. "None of those are called Manhwa," the boy says. The shock hits Chang Mayang deeply. How could Manhwa, the revered sect he had dedicated his life to raising to greatness, have vanished from the ranks of the world's elite? Seizing the boy by his collar again, he demands answers, his grip tight with urgency. The boy, now bracing himself, fears another barrage of questions. He admits that he has heard of a sect by that name, though it's located in the remote Shaanxi region. Chang Mayang's heart lifts briefly with hope, but the boy quickly adds that as far as he knows, that sect is not among the 10 strongest. Crestfallen, recalls that Manhwa had been in ruins when he'd first heard of it long ago. Releasing the boy, Chang Mayang murmurs to himself, "To believe it, I'll have to go see for myself." Clenching his fists, he makes his resolve. He will go to Manhwa. Amused, the boy scoffs, suggesting Chang Mayang would be better off begging in the streets unless he wants to starve. Ignoring him, Chang Mayang declares he has questions that need answers and warns the boy against lying. Striking his chest proudly, he demands the boy's name. The boy shrugs and answers, "People just call Chong." Chang Mayang inquires about his age. The boy, with a smirk, replies, "Who knows the age of a beggar?" Satisfied with Chong's answers, Chang Mayang asks for the name of the boy who had beaten him, and Chong introduces him as Guo, leader of the beggar sect. Eyes narrowed, Chang Mayang remarks, "Good deeds are repaid doubly, but vengeance returns tenfold." He instructs Chong to remember the name Chang Mayang of Mount Hua, promising that one day he will repay this kindness. Turning on his heel, he begins to march off, then stops abruptly to ask which direction leads to Mount Hua. Chong points, and within seconds, birds scatter as Chang Mayang bolts through the forest, determined to make his way. However, his newfound body betrays him. Soon he is gasping for air, and his legs, unused to the exertion, give way beneath him. Collapsing to the ground, he curses his small, weak frame, recalling how in his former life he could easily outrun a horse. Now, barely able to last 15 minutes, he feels his heart pounding so hard it might burst. Lying in the dirt, his face against the earth, Chang Mayang wonders how he will even make it to the distant Shaanxi region at this rate. But then a smile creeps onto his face as he realizes that this is an opportunity, a fresh start. Those who reach the pinnacle of mastery often have regrets, and he has his share, beginning with his laziness and his habit of avoiding the training grounds when he was younger. Often he had ignored the wisdom of the elders, preferring instead to steal their wine, much to their fury. Some things, he muses, he doesn't intend to change, even in this new life. With newfound resolve, he walks to a sturdy tree and sits down, remembering his first steps in martial training. Now he just needs to start over. Recalling countless energy-boosting techniques, he considers which one to try. Finally, he remembers the 6 elements, an old, humble text he once bought on the streets for 5 coins. Though simple, it was no ordinary technique. It was foundational for all Manhwa disciples. It had no grand promises, but it was ideal for those building strength from the ground up. This technique purifies the practitioner's body, setting a solid foundation for anyone willing to advance slowly and steadily, exactly what he now needs. Chang Mayang, seated by the tree, slowly begins to gather energy, feeling it circulate within him. The 6 elements technique takes effect, rooting deep into his core. Gradually, he senses a purifying force rising through his body, each breath bringing a tiny surge of purified energy toward the center of his being. This small but steady accumulation is his new foundation. With a determined smile, he stands up, declaring that this sea of power within him will be the start of an unstoppable avalanche. But the moment he rises, he feels the surge vanish. Drained of energy, he collapses to the ground, realizing he has used up everything he had just gathered. Flat on his back, he recalls his brother Jamon's old teasing words, that his biggest problem was not using his head properly. He sighs, wondering how he'll ever reach Mount Hua at this sluggish pace. The scene shifts to a bustling city. In a narrow alley, a few boys rush over to their big brother, warning him that a new beggar is drawing attention and money from the passers-by. Just a small kid, but people are giving him coins anyway. The older boy with a mohawk grins, vowing to teach this young beggar the rules of their territory. Excited, the group eagerly follows him. A little later, they find a small boy sitting in the corner, quietly eating. It's Chang Mayang. Hearing the shouts, he glances over his shoulder, asking if they're speaking to him. The boy with the mohawk steps forward, mocking Chang Mayang and telling him he's on their turf and must hand over everything he has, including the food in his hand. Chang Mayang, looking at his half-eaten food, mutters about their greed, amused that they'd even want his leftovers. The boys crack their knuckles, preparing to teach him a lesson. Chang Mayang stands and, with a slight smirk, throws a casual punch, warning them that he's still not very strong but has grown accustomed to this body, and that they'll regret it if they don't come at him all at once. Furious, the beggar leader snarls, deciding not to go easy on the newcomer, and orders his gang to take him down. The first boy lunges, but Chang Mayang easily dodges, counters, and strikes him hard across the cheek, sending him flying back. With calm confidence, Chang Mayang introduces himself as the master of the blossoming blade, Chang Mayang of the great Mount Hua. A short brawl ensues, but the tide quickly turns, and the gang, overwhelmed, soon apologizes, begging for mercy. Chang Mayang tells them not to call him sir. After all, he's just a beggar too. When one of them calls him a mere beggar, Chang Mayang feels a sting of disrespect but lets it slide, asking instead for the fastest route to Shanxi. The gang members exchange confused looks and reply that if he were smart, he wouldn't be begging on the streets in the first place. Chang Mayang laughs, agreeing with them in good humor, before suddenly grabbing one by the collar and threatening that if he can't provide directions the next time they meet, he'll suffer. The gang scrambles off in terror as he watches them go, telling them to scram. As the sun begins to set over the distant mountains, the scene shifts to an older man, standing at the edge of a high cliff, gazing out over the valleys. A voice calls out, and he turns to see a younger man, who introduces himself as Unam. Unam informs him that a child has arrived, asking to see the sect leader. The old man's brow furrows in surprise, and he asks Unam why he didn't simply tell the child that they're no longer accepting disciples. Unam explains that he did, but the boy insisted on seeing the leader himself. Outside, waiting patiently but fuming internally, Chongmayang stands with a strained smile on his face. Chang Mayang finally reached the entrance to Manhwa, exhausted but triumphant. Those beggars had pointed him down a shortcut that turned out to be utterly useless. Yet somehow he'd managed to find his way back to the sect. Now the hardest part awaited him, the ascent. Step by step, he climbed the ancient stone staircase, trudging through mud, scaling rough mountain paths, each step echoing memories of the countless times he'd walked this road in his previous life. But in this new body, the journey was grueling. Despite the hardship, he pressed on, driven by an unyielding determination. At last, he arrived at the top of Manhwa, but the sight that met him left him speechless. The entrance to the sect was bare. There wasn't even a sign bearing the name of Manhwa. He vividly remembered his brother, Jamon, diligently cleaning that sign every morning. As he stood there, the door creaked open, and a man stepped out, eyeing him curiously. "What's a child doing here?" the man asked, clearly puzzled by Chang Mayang's presence. He seemed genuinely surprised that a kid had managed to climb the mountain alone. Chang Mayang, ignoring the question, stared intently at the man. "I have to know. Are you a disciple of Manhwa?" The man nodded, confirming he was indeed a disciple, and Chang Mayang felt a surge of relief that Manhwa hadn't been completely erased. The disciple, whose name was Unam, invited him inside, explaining that while they didn't normally allow visitors, it was too late to turn him away. Nights on the mountain were harsh, after all. However, the moment Chang Mayang stepped through the gates, a new wave of shock washed over him. The training grounds, once a magnificent marble arena, were now just a barren field. Unam noticed his expression and asked if anything was wrong. Chang Mayang forced a smile, pretending to admire the incredible training area, while in reality he could hardly believe the state of decay. As his gaze swept the surroundings, he noticed another absence. The Palace of the Heavens, once a grand structure nearby, had vanished entirely. Feigning confusion, he remarked on the odd sight of a staircase that now led nowhere and asked what had happened. Unam explained that the elders spoke of a palace that once stood there long ago. Unam, assuming he wouldn't understand, described the loss as a glorious battle scar of the sect's past. Chang Mayang murmured under his breath that there was nothing glorious about the ruin around him, but he quickly brushed off Unam's questioning glance with a vague excuse. Leading the way, Unam took him to the Jade Temple, assuring him that he'd find shelter here. To Chang Mayang's relief, the temple was at least still standing. Unam pushed open the door and began explaining that at Manhwa, they honor the righteous path and revere those who came before. But as soon as Chang Mayang stepped inside, he felt a pang of dismay. Treasures that once adorned this hall were gone. The treasured candle gifted by Emperor Jin Birkin, the golden pot, and the scroll inscribed by the ancestors all missing. He approached the altar, muttering to himself, "Wasn't there supposed to be a flower here?" Unam, catching his words, looked at him with surprise. "How do you know about that?" he asked. Paused, then replied thoughtfully, "There used to be a cherry blossom sculpture here, crafted from metal. We sold it. Didn't match the aesthetics here, and a merchant made a good offer, so it's long gone." His mind flashed to his brother Jamon's words. The petals of Manhwa's legacy were gone, and those who remained had sold away its treasures. This was, in Chang Mayang's view, the end of Manhwa's greatness. Seeing his pained expression, Unam approached and asked if he was all right. Chang Mayang took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. No, he couldn't let it end like this. This place, the legacy of Manhwa, needed restoration, and he would be the one to make it happen. Dropping to his knees, he looked Unam in the eyes. I have a request, he said, his voice steady with purpose. I wish to become a disciple of Manhwa. Returning to the present, the sect leader sits across from Chang Mayang, regarding him with a piercing gaze. He asks why Chang Mayang wants to join Manhwa, and whether he truly understands what sort of place it is. Without hesitation, Chang Mayang replies, Yes, I understand. He knows that his acceptance won't come easily, but he has already crafted the perfect story to win the old man over. In his mind, he recalls a sect member named Jiam Jing, who had disappeared during the Great War. Chang Mayang plans to tell the leader that Jiam Jing was found on the mountain by a passerby, a man who saved him from certain death. Out of gratitude, Jiam Jing taught his rescuer the martial techniques of Manhwa. Chang Mayang, claiming to be the descendant of this man, would therefore be a direct disciple of a revered sect member, granting him equal status to other senior members without having to start from scratch. However, before he can even begin his story, the sect leader nods, saying, I accept. Chang Mayang blinks in surprise. He hadn't expected such an easy acceptance. He stammers, asking why he's being allowed in so readily. The old man replies simply, You seem eager to join. How could I turn you away? Unam, watching the exchange, mutters that this is strange, as they hadn't been accepting new disciples for years. But the elder waves his hand, saying, Sometimes destiny works in mysterious ways. Chang Mayang is both puzzled and annoyed. Why isn't this old man even slightly suspicious of him, a total stranger? But the leader smiles warmly, explaining that the sect never turned away a bird seeking shelter from the rain. Manhwa had always shared its food with those in need. Rejecting this boy now would go against the sect's principles. He instructs Unam to show Chang Mayang to the beginner's quarters and begin the initiation process. Yet Chang Mayang's spirits sink. His grand plan of entering the sect as an esteemed figure has crumbled, and he's left with only the lowly rank of a new disciple. The scene shifts to Chang Mayang clad in a plain robe, the simple uniform of a third-grade disciple. As he inspects his quarters, a small, bare room used in old rituals, he notes with dismay that this doesn't seem to be a temporary arrangement. In the Manhwa he once knew, new disciples were given mentors and lived alongside them, receiving personalized guidance. As he explores the area, a voice suddenly shouts at him. Chang Mayang turns around to see a young disciple glaring at him. The boy demands to know why he's snooping near other people's rooms and accuses him of being a bandit. Before Chang Mayang can respond, more disciples appear, one of them asking what the commotion is about. I caught this kid snooping around the senior brother's room. The boy, whose name is Joel, announces while Chang Mayang sighs internally, wondering why he always ends up in absurd situations like this. Just then, another disciple arrives, frowning at the noisy scene in the dormitory. What's going on? He asks, his tone authoritative. The disciples immediately fall silent, bowing and apologizing to the great brother. He turns to Chang Mayang, asking who he is. My name's Chan Wayan, he answers. The senior disciple nods, explaining that he heard about a new arrival and tells him to rest for now, but warns that tomorrow training will be rigorous. With that, he dismisses everyone to their quarters. The disciples obediently shout in agreement and disperse, though Joel lingers, shooting Chang Mayang a cold stare, muttering that he'll see him later to teach him some manners. Chang Mayang, now thoroughly annoyed, mentally notes that these juniors need proper supervision. He decides he'll be happy to set them straight, though they'll have to learn the hard way. Later, Joel confronts him again, ordering him to remove his robe, then adding with a sneer, Take off all your clothes. Chang Mayang pauses, realizing they're setting him up for some humiliating initiation ritual, a common enough ordeal for new disciples. Staying silent, he meets Joel's gaze and says, I have a question first. Does senior brother Unjo know about all this? Joel scoffs, telling him that senior brother Unjo doesn't come to the dorms at night, and adds a threat, suggesting that Chang Mayang start obeying if he doesn't want a beating. Chang Mayang smirks and says, All right, Joel, brace yourself. Before Joel can react, Chang Mayang's fist is already flying toward his face, sending Joel crashing against the ceiling, dazed. The other disciples stand, stunned, as Joel's limp form dangles from the rafters. Calmly, Chang Mayang dusts his hands, turning to the rest. As the fight breaks out, Chang Mayang expertly beats down his would-be initiators, teaching them a lesson they won't soon forget. Later, the scene shifts to a relaxed Chang Mayang, calling out to senior brother, instructing him to give him a proper massage. Obliges, apologizing that he'll try to do his best. Chang Mayang then summons Juel, who is still trembling from their earlier scuffle, and tells him to come closer. He has questions about the current state of Manhwa, and Juel promises to answer anything he asks. Chang Mayang's first question is about the fate of the Golden Palace and why the sect fell into ruin. Juel's face grows solemn as he begins to explain. He asks if Chang Mayang has ever heard of the legendary Master of the Blossoming Blade. Chang Mayang smirks, muttering that, of course, he knows the name. After all, it's his own. Oblivious, Well continues. He tells him that the Master of the Blossoming Blade was the hero who killed Jinam, the demonic cult leader. But, following Jinam's death, the demonic cult retaliated, launching a brutal assault on Manhwa. The siege left the sect in ruins, and it never recovered. Hearing this, Chang Mayang is hit by a wave of shock and guilt. His mind reels with the realization that his own actions may have indirectly led to Manhwa's collapse. He recalls a flashback of a conversation with Jamon, one of Manhwa's leaders, who often joked with him about outdated techniques and useless traditions. Chang Mayang had even once suggested throwing certain techniques out entirely. Jamon had agreed, then turned serious and asked Chang Mayang to consider taking on an apprentice. Chang Mayang's response had been blunt. He'd teach any apprentice by beating them until they learned. Jamon, exasperated, never brought up the idea again. Snapping back to the present, Chang Mayang is jolted from his memories as a disciple approaches and calls him senior brother. Amused, he tells them to just call him junior brother, as it feels odd to hear such titles directed at him. The disciple informs him that senior brother Unjam has summoned everyone to the training grounds. A short time later, Chang Mayang stands among the gathered disciples, watching as Unam instructs them on basic drills. At Unam's command, they raise their swords and execute a strike. Beside him, a boy named Nam explains proudly that the technique they're practicing is called the true six-element sword technique. Nam adds that it's the foundation of all techniques in Manhwa. Chang Mayang's expression darkens. He knows the true foundational techniques of Manhwa, and this six-element sword technique is far from it. A true martial artist needed a strong, slow-built foundation. What he sees here, however, are hollow teachings intended for short-term gains. He glances up at the clear, empty sky, feeling a pang of despair. Turning to Nam, he calls the boy over, startling him. Chang Mayang asks what kind of training they receive after mastering this technique. Eagerly explains that after the six-element sword, they'll study the sword technique of the seven sages. Next, they move to the Blossom Hall, where they learn the clarity of the sword technique. Chang Mayang tries to hide his disappointment, but can't shake the sinking feeling in his chest. Nam then adds excitedly that after these techniques, they'll advance to the Great Sword Pacification Technique, which he describes as the pinnacle of Manhwa's martial arts. Chang Mayang's eyes narrow as he hears this. He recalls that technique well. It was one he had actually told them to discard years ago, deeming it ineffective and a poor use of time. He'd even ordered it to be removed from the sect's library. And now, that same worthless technique was being hailed as Manhwa's greatest achievement. As the instructor continues to drill the disciples, urging them to take their training more seriously, Chang Mayang quietly observes. The scene shifts to nighttime, where he calls for Brother Juel, who approaches with a hint of trepidation. Chang Mayang sighs, reminding him to relax, and then confides that he has a favor to ask. He instructs Juel to gather all the disciples in the training hall at 5 a.m., listing a few items he'll need prepared, including 5 for each person. Juel hesitates, asking if he's sure about this, to which Chang Mayang responds with a confident smile, daring Juel to doubt him. Assured, Juel nods, agreeing to handle everything, and departs. Left alone, Chang Mayang reflects on the state of Manhwa. No money, no renowned techniques, no promising talent. Right now, the only thing he has to contribute is his skill, but he'll have to make use of even these inexperienced third-class disciples to restore Manhwa's former glory. A grand sect, he muses, isn't rebuilt in a day. As dawn breaks, the disciples are jolted awake, grumbling and cursing under their breaths as they gather in the training hall. Frustrated, They demand to know why they're following the orders of this strange new junior brother at such an ungodly hour. Muttering amongst themselves, they share tales of how Chang Mayang had already overpowered some of them in unexpected ways. Just then, Chang Mayang enters, grinning as he hears them talking about him. They immediately fall silent, startled at his sudden presence. One disciple, braver than the rest, steps forward and asks, "Who do you think you are to drag us here at 5 a.m.?" Chang Mayang holds up his hands, a feigned expression of apology crossing his face. "All right, brothers, don't be so angry. I apologize. I truly didn't consider your feelings. Why don't we step into that room over there for a quick talk?" With that, he gestures toward a small building nearby. The reluctant disciples, those least interested in training, shuffle into the room. The door closes, and a few moments later, the entire house begins to shake, as if struck by a violent force. Joel and the others outside stare wide-eyed, realizing Chang Mayang is up to something. Suddenly, the disciples come bursting out of the building, looking utterly terrified, forming a formal line without a word of complaint. Chang Mayang nods in satisfaction, remarking that they seem more motivated now. He announces that, from this day forward, physical training will begin at 5 a.m. sharp, calling them all useless senior brothers. Meanwhile, in his private quarters, senior brother Unam stirs, surprised to find none of the disciples coming to greet him at sunrise. Assuming they must still be asleep due to the antics of the new disciple, he steps outside, ready to teach them a lesson about discipline. But the sight that greets him stops him in his tracks. The training field is littered with exhausted disciples, collapsed on the ground like defeated old men. Furious, Unam demands to know what's going on, his gaze scanning the crowd until he spots Joel, completely worn out and lying flat among the others. Finally, his eyes land on Chang Mayang, squatting in the corner with two massive rocks. Exhaling with effort, Chang Mayang lifts the stones once more, having already completed over 10,000 repetitions. Noticing Unam's presence, he grins, greeting him with a cheerful, "Good morning, senior brother." Unam, bewildered, watches the boy's ragged breath and trembling arms, but is astonished at his tenacity. Seeing that Chang Mayang is clearly on the edge of exhaustion, he immediately orders water to be brought. Chang Mayang politely declines, letting the rocks down. Unam, his patience wearing thin, insists that Chang Mayang explain what's been going on. Chang Mayang shrugs, flashing an innocent smile. "Nothing serious, senior brother. We just woke up a little early for some extra training." Chang Mayang, with his usual calm yet intense demeanor, looks at senior brother Unam, who's surveying the group of exhausted disciples sprawled across the training ground. But then he catches a glimpse of the disciples' expressions: fear, respect, and a hint of dread, all directed toward Chang Mayang. Irritated, Unam decides it's time to remind this upstart that even the White Blossom Hall has rules. He demands to know who granted permission for them to cut their sleep and train early. Chang Mayang adopts a clueless expression, saying that if it's against the rules, they'll simply stop training. Unam is momentarily thrown off, unsure how to handle this response. After all, it's apparent that the innocent boy standing before him has the others under his thumb. Acknowledging that exposing this would only make the teachers and disciples of Manhwa look foolish, Unam remains silent. Chang Mayang then speaks up, requesting just 1 month to train alongside the disciples. He assures Unam that, in that time, they'll see incredible improvement. His only reason for suggesting this, he says, is that the senior disciples seem so strangely motivated. The crowd of disciples, looking utterly exhausted yet resigned, mutters their reluctant agreement. Onam realizes that the boy has somehow ensured no one dares to tell the truth about the intense training they've endured. Intrigued, Unam asks why Chang Mayang, despite being just as fatigued as the rest, seems so driven to wake up early every day. Chang Mayang responds with a calm certainty. "Every minute spent in bed is a minute lost from training. The harder we push ourselves, the faster we improve." Unam, understanding the underlying message, to test him, Unam asks what Chang Mayang thinks is most important in a relationship with senior brothers. "Respect, of course," Chang Mayang replies smoothly, promising to honor their commands. Impressed, Unam realizes that Chang Mayang is clever enough to respect the hierarchy, at least outwardly, maintaining his place without causing unnecessary disruption. Seeing an opportunity, Unam turns to the disciples, shouting that he's genuinely impressed with their dedication to early training, and that if they keep it up, they'll soon become stronger than ever. This wasn't the encouragement the exhausted disciples were hoping for, and some begin to mutter pleas for help, but Unam hurries off, leaving them to their fate. With a clenched fist, Chang Mayang glares at the disciples who dared to ask for help. "What kind of help are you asking for?" he growls. "Do you think I'm here to harm you? Now, perhaps we should discuss this further. Inside." He leads the reluctant group back into the hall, and the sounds of a grueling training session soon echo through the sect. Days pass, and Chang Mayang continues his intense routine. His energy center, though still small and weak, is finally starting to form, each practice session bringing him closer to restoring his inner power. As he trains, he also uncovers more of Manhwa's sad decline. The sect had once flourished under powerful leaders and rigorous training, but over time, a lack of skilled teachers and the creation of the devotion system had led to Manhwa's downfall. The current sect leader and the two headmasters are well-meaning and kind-hearted, but shockingly weak, with their strength barely comparable to an average disciple from a century ago. Consequently, the third-class disciples lack proper training and discipline. But Chang Mayang remains unfazed. He's determined that, with his guidance, Manhwa will rise again as the greatest sect in the land. This is his ultimate mission. In the dining hall, a weary disciple tries to grab some food, but his hand, sore and bruised from Chang Mayang's intense training, trembles, causing him to drop his bowl. Grimacing, he mutters that while training hard is important, they should at least need the energy to be able to eat. He suggests to Joel that someone should talk to Chang Mayang and ask him to ease up on the training. But Joel dismisses the idea with a scoff, refusing to play messenger. If anyone has a problem with Chang Mayang, they can take it up with him directly. Standing up, he mentions that he needs to speak with Yan Zhong and heads outside. Once outside, Joel strikes up a conversation with Yan Zhong, who remarks that he seems more at ease lately. Joel pauses, then asks a weighty question. "What do you think of Manhwa?" Yan Zhong is taken aback, calling it a tough question. Joel continues, saying he could return to his family anytime, but he knows that Yan Zhong's dream is to make a life in the sect. Yan Zhong nods in agreement. Joel admits that he once thought Manhwa had no future, a sentiment that Yan Zhong warns him not to repeat. But Joel explains that his perspective has shifted since Chang Mayang arrived. While the early morning training sessions were grueling and forced, he now realizes he'd never trained so hard, never pushed himself to his limits until now. Watching Chang Mayang's unwavering dedication, training longer and harder than anyone else, has inspired him. He turns to Yan Zhong and declares that from today onward, he will give 100% to becoming a true martial artist. Yan Zhong smiles, agreeing wholeheartedly. Unbeknownst to them, Chang Mayang sits in a nearby tree, listening with a smirk. He's pleased to see that two more disciples are now genuinely motivated. Though he's encountered some resistance, he thinks to himself that there's still a long road ahead to revitalize the sect. Suddenly, a loud banging echoes from the sect's entrance, and an angry voice demands that the leader come out. Startled, Chang Mayang sees a group of strangers, some kicking the doors and others shouting for the disciples to fetch the leader. Before anyone can respond, the intruders begin forcing their way into the sect. Unam and Unjo, two senior disciples, look on in embarrassment while Chang Mayang narrows his eyes, wondering who these people are and why they've come here. The visitors, clearly frustrated, complain that they've waited long enough and want to know when they'll finally be repaid. In that moment, Chang Mayang realizes that Manhwa is deeply in debt. Watching the scene unfold, he mutters to himself, "So on top of everything else, they're drowning in debt. Aren't you ashamed to hide inside? Come out and face them." The door creaks open, and the sect leader steps outside to meet the crowd. Chang Mayang observes closely, immediately noticing the leader's calm, composed demeanor. Every movement and word carries a subtle wisdom as the elder exchanges greetings, attempting to keep the conversation controlled. Mangong, the leader of the visiting group, clears his throat and gives a faintly mocking smile. "It seems the sect leader is doing quite well," he says. The elder, unfazed, replies that he hadn't expected the great pavilion leader to come all the way to Manhwa, adding that it's unfortunate they must meet under such dire circumstances. Mong Gong, with a hint of sarcasm, remarks that the sect leader must be fully aware of the situation. The debt repayment deadline has long passed. He reminds them that his organization has favored Manhwa for years, showing leniency far beyond what was owed. But now their patience has run out. He gives the sect a final warning, 7 days to repay their debt. If they fail, he will take over all of Manhwa's land. One of the young disciples lets out a gasp, catching the attention of the intruders. Mongong's men turn to him, apologizing that an apprentice had to witness this uncomfortable exchange. Chang Mayang, watching from the side, clenches his fists, realizing the gravity of the situation. One of the senior disciples quietly explains to Chang Mayang that the visitors are from the Huan prefecture and hold considerable power. Johan Mayang is deep in thought, piecing together the situation, while a young disciple next to him looks nervously for a chance to slip away before receiving another beating. Joel, sensing something unusual, asks if the Huan prefecture lies just below Mount Hua. The boy confirms, prompting Joel to speculate whether Mount Hua's merchants had to borrow money from the prefecture. The boy, uncertain, says he's only heard of Mong Gong, the owner of the prestigious Huan Pavilion, the largest tavern in the city. At the mention of the pavilion, Johan's expression hardens as he recalls its name. Cracking his neck in irritation, he realizes something is wrong. Taiho Pavilion has always belonged to Mount Hua. Seeing his growing agitation, the boys quickly urge him to stay calm, but Johan grabs one of them by the collar, demanding to know if the pavilion loaned money to Mount Hua and now plans to seize the sect. The boy reluctantly confirms it. This revelation makes no sense to Johan. Why would Mount Hua, historically the owner of the pavilion, borrow from it? Something must have gone terribly wrong while he was gone. Immediately, he calls for Joel, who jumps in surprise, then orders him to retrieve a particular item. Joel, puzzled but obedient, scurries off and returns with a robe. When he asks why Johan wants it, Johan responds cryptically with an old Buddhist saying, "Sometimes to meet Buddha, you must kill him," meaning sometimes one must stray from the righteous path to find enlightenment. Donning the robe, he prepares to follow this teaching, shocking the disciples as he prepares to leave the sect. In a swift movement, Johan leaps over the wall, his gaze fixed on the city below. In the heart of the pavilion, Mong Gong and his associates are laughing, relishing the discomfort of Mount Hua's leader. They mockingly comment that the elders seemed too shocked to respond to their ultimatum, and one man named Ngu sneers that Mount Hua deserves its fate, especially after borrowing over 100,000 coins. Mong Gong that even though he's a merchant who values wealth, it's understandable if he feels a bit conflicted about destroying a place so significant to his ancestors. A man in a blue robe tries to reassure Mong Gong, reminding him that they've extended the repayment deadline countless times. Surely the city would recognize his generosity. Though Mount Hua's martial prowess may have faded, its legacy still wields power in the Shanxi region. Most people here still know of Mount Hua's illustrious history, and for years Mong Gong has been quietly amassing strength to finally put an end to it. Like a frog in a pot of slowly heating water, Mount Hua has been boiling, oblivious to its impending ruin. One of Mong Gong's men, Zhang Yu, asks what he plans to do with Mount Hua's land once it's seized, suggesting it could easily be sold off. Mong Gong, however, explains that the location holds much more value than they realize. Even if the land seems abandoned, it carries immense symbolic worth. Setting down his chopsticks with a dark smile, he says he hadn't intended to reveal his plans so soon. He urges his men to think like Mount Hua's enemies. Imagine the wealth they could gain from powerful people willing to pay to erase every trace of Mount Hua's legacy. His men, struck by the brilliance of the plan, nod enthusiastically, suggesting they'll have to celebrate Mong Gong's vision. As they laugh and discuss their newfound wealth, a man named Jason heads home, marveling at how profitable Mount Hua's downfall will be. Confident that he can trust Mong Gong to deliver, he walks off into the night, glancing up with a smile, unknowingly under Johan's watchful eye. Jongin pauses, staring up at the moonless sky, wondering why it's absent tonight. Meanwhile, Chang Mayang stands silently in his path, watching him. When Jongin's vision focuses, he sees the boy standing boldly in the open, as if inviting attention. Jongen crosses his arms, smirking at the strange sight of such a small, skinny thief, who seems almost eager to be seen. With a raised eyebrow, he taunts the boy, assuming he must be trying to rob him. But Chang Mayang remains calm. I'm not interested in money, he replies evenly. I'm only here for some answers. Jongen chuckles, saying he'd normally help out a kid, but tonight the boy's luck has run out because he'll be facing the friends Jongen brought along. At his signal, a group of burly men step forward, revealed as caravan guards. One of them, eyeing Chang Mayang, asks Jongen if they should just kill the boy, but Jongen waves them off, explaining that he only wants to question him. A cacophony of battle noises erupts behind him. Puzzled, he orders his men to take it easy on the boy. He turns, shocked to see that all of his guards have been taken out. Standing calmly among the fallen guards, Chang Mayang looks at Jongen and says, I only wanted to talk, but your men weren't exactly polite. Jongen, rattled, agrees to answer whatever the boy wants if he can avoid further trouble. Chang Mayang, unimpressed, grabs him by the collar. Well then, he says coldly, I offered you a chance to avoid a beating, but since you refused, I'll have to teach you a lesson. Moments later, Jongen is sprawled on the ground, swollen and barely coherent, muttering nonsense. Chang Mayang crouches over him, giving him a firm warning. If you don't start making sense, we'll go through this again. He demands to know the story behind the 100,000 coin debt that Manhwa supposedly owes. Jongen groans, confirming that it's all true. But Chang Mayang narrows his eyes. He knows that neither Jongen nor these merchants from a struggling city could ever amass that kind of fortune, let alone loan it. So how did they manage to lend 100,000 coins to Manhwa? Jongen, gritting his teeth, explains how the merchants created a snowball effect, with interest, inflating a small initial debt into an insurmountable amount over time. Chang Mayang punches him sharply in the head. And you're proud of this? He asks, disgusted. He then asks Jongen if he owns the linen shop in town, and the man confirms it. When did you buy it? Chang Mayang presses. Jongen, baffled, says the shop has been in his family for generations. But this, too, makes no sense to Chang Mayang. That linen shop, along with every major business in Huan Prefecture, has always belonged to Manhwa. The city had only thrived due to the sect's influence, and Manhwa had once entrusted the merchants with managing these businesses. Now it's clear they've been stealing from the sect all along. As if on cue, an angry voice interrupts, calling Chang Mayang a coward and a shameless little thief, demanding he reveal himself. Chang Mayang releases Jongen and turns to find another man glaring at him. Amused, Chang Mayang asks why he's so desperate to know his name. The man retorts, I demand to know the name of anyone I'm about to cut down. Chang Mayang tilts his head, feigning confusion. Weren't you just knocked out a moment ago? He asks with a smirk. This only infuriates the swordsman further. Drawing his blade, he charges at Chang Mayang, shouting for him to get ready. Chang Mayang remains calm, knowing he has far greater speed and strength than his opponent, but he doesn't consider raw power as the true measure of skill. There are far more important qualities in battle. In a flash, he catches the sword in his hand and, with a swift motion, deflects the attack using his shoulder. The man stumbles back, utterly bewildered, unable to comprehend how this skinny little thief managed to counter him so effortlessly. His current body may be that of a child, lacking the physical strength he once had, but his technique remains flawless. He decides to use the man's own strength against him, skillfully redirecting the attack and sending the opponent flying. Chang Mayang extends his arm, drawing his sword with practiced grace as a few cherry blossom petals appear around him. He looks at the defeated man, stating coolly, You still have a lot to learn. With a swift movement, he's behind the man, executing the double blossom sword technique. The poor swordsman collapses, unconscious. However, a sudden gasp of awe catches Chang Mayang's attention. He'd forgotten about Jongen, who'd witnessed the entire scene, watching him in astonished silence. As Chang Mayang turns, he realizes that Jongen may have recognized the technique. With a mixture of awe and suspicion, Jongen blurts out that these refined attacks, the martial mastery, and that blade technique remind him of the Zongman sect. Chang Mayang hesitates, trying to mask his surprise, but realizing it's safer to play along, he nods. Exactly right. I'm a member of the great Zongman sect. Jongen, convinced and eager to impress such a martial artist, promises to tell him everything he wants to know. Chang Mayang, satisfied with the cover story, thanks him, thinking this close call at least ensured his true identity remained hidden. Back at Manhwa, Jianmu and Yanzhong paced nervously, wondering why Chang Mayang hadn't returned yet. Jianmu mutters he's sure the boy will come back, unless, of course, something bad has happened. Just then, the door creaks open, and Chang Mayang strolls in, asking casually if anything happened while he was gone. But it's Jianmu and Yanzhong who demand to know what he'd been doing out there. With a faint smile, Chang Mayang brushes it off, saying it was nothing serious, and that he even made a little extra money on the side. As he speaks, he recalls Zhonggen's assumption about him being from the Zongmen sect. Though he's glad his real identity remains undiscovered, it stings a bit to have Manhwa's signature technique, the blossoming blade, mistaken for another sect's. As Jianmu and Yanzhong continue questioning him, Chang Mayang gives a vague answer, saying, "Kids don't need to know." They scoff, reminding him that he's just a kid too. But he quickly changes the subject, telling them to gather everyone for training. Jianmu, confused, points out that it's late, but Chang Mayang silences him, saying that rain or shine, day or night, training will not be missed. Jianmu, catching his enthusiasm, begins to get excited and runs off to rally the disciples. He asks Chang Mayang if he'll join them for training, but Chang Mayang shakes his head, saying he has other things to attend to. Jianmu insists that without him, no one would take the training seriously. Chang Mayang, however, reassures him, "I already know that." With the room finally quiet, Chang Mayang collapses onto his bed, letting his mind wander. The situation was more complicated than he initially thought. Not only were the city merchants trying to seize Manhwa's properties, but the original documents proving the sect's ownership of those businesses were probably lost during the attack. Simply storming into the city and taking back control would only worsen Manhwa's already fragile reputation. He needed irrefutable proof that they were the rightful owners of the land. As he ponders, he remembers Jamun's meticulous record-keeping, how he'd seen Jamun filling out ownership records long ago. But when he glanced over those papers, there had only been a few documents, which struck him as odd. Manhwa had owned so much more, and those records could never have covered everything. This means Jamun must have hidden the full records elsewhere. Chang Mayang recalls hearing rumors of a hidden vault, accessible only to the sect leader. Based on his memory, he suspects that the vault entrance is likely near the leader's house, as that area hadn't changed at all since his time, hidden somewhere within Manhwa's ancient depths. The only way to access it, he suspects, is through an underground base he's only heard rumors of. With a sigh and a reluctant grin, he mutters an apology to Jamun, promising he'll only take a look at the treasure, and, though uncertain if he'll keep that promise, vows to deliver it straight to the leader. The scene shifts to the dark, rocky mountainside where Chang Mayang lies sprawled on the ground, panting from exhaustion. Searching the mountain's vastness has drained him. He'd severely underestimated the challenge, especially since each attempt to locate the vault requires him to channel energy into the earth and feel for any hidden structure resisting his force. Over and over, he concentrates his energy into his palms and slams them against the ground, searching. Though exhausted, he refuses to give up, repeating the technique relentlessly until suddenly a strange sensation tingles through his energy field. With renewed excitement, Chang Mayang strikes the ground again, this time wielding a pickaxe. "Found it," he grins. "Now, to dig out this cursed treasure." After what feels like hours, he finally uncovers a concrete ceiling beneath the rock, a hidden corridor. The corridor must lead to the real vault, but just as he's about to explore further, he hears footsteps. Chang Mayang quickly ducks back into the shadows, silently observing as the sect leader approaches. The leader stops in front of the hidden door, his hand trembling as he reaches toward it. Watching this, Chang Mayang realizes the truth. The leader isn't hesitating out of fear of revealing the door's secret mechanism. He's simply unable to do anything. The man before him isn't a guardian of a powerful vault, but a weary leader watching his sect decay before his eyes. Chang Mayang finally understands the burden the leader bears, seeing a once great place he devoted his life to now on the brink of collapse. This hidden corridor is the one place where the leader can let his mask slip and show his true emotions. As dawn breaks, Chang Mayang, now determined, slips back into the tunnel after the leader departs. He knows he shares some responsibility for the sect's current state, but he also believes it isn't too late to turn things around. First, however, he must get through the door. Steeling himself, he places his hand on the metal and sends out an energy impact, but it's instantly repelled. His eyes narrow as he recognizes the material, millennium metal, an impenetrable alloy that renders brute force useless. Now he understands why the leader stood before it with such a look of helplessness. Realizing that traditional methods won't work, Chang Mayang studies the door closely. A pattern catches his eye, a series of sword marks etched into the metal. He squints, recognizing it as the intricate design of the 24 blossoming blade technique. Suddenly it clicks. To open the door, he must perform the Violet Dawn Kai, blending several techniques in precise sequence to unlock it. But there's a problem. In his past life, these techniques would have been second nature, but now, in this child's body, he lacks the strength and energy to execute them all. The combination requires immense skill and perfect control over one's chi, both things he currently doesn't possess. Sighing, he adjusts his hair with a resigned look. I really didn't want to have to do this, he mutters to himself. Slapping his stomach, he makes a decision. Looks like I'll need to take a month-long vacation. Chang Mayang steels himself, knowing he'll need to draw upon the deepest reserves of energy he possesses, his trinate Kai, the life force each person is born with, which sustains them over time. He's aware that using this energy shortens his lifespan, but with no other options, he knows he has to take the risk. As he taps into this energy, a vibrant purple aura envelops him, radiating with intensity. His sword is raised, and he mutters, "One chance, just one shot to open this door." He swings his sword, executing the first cut, and immediately feels the toll as blood sputters from his mouth. His body grows heavier, the weight of the technique pressing down on him. With each successive movement, he fights to maintain the flow, flawlessly linking one form of the 6 elements technique to the next. His hands follow with the 24 blossoming blade technique, each slice creating glowing patterns across the door. Finally, he completes the sequence, collapsing to the ground just as the entire door illuminates. Panting and coughing up blood, he stares at the door, whispering, "Did it work?" If this attempt failed, he had nothing left to try. Just then, a faint sound echoes in the corridor as a gust of wind sweeps through, and with a rumble, the door slowly begins to open. Despite his pain, Chang Mayang smiles through blood-stained lips, knowing he has succeeded. This sacrifice, he tells himself, is the price he must pay if he's to save Manhwa. He watches as the massive door creaks open, revealing a hidden chamber. Forcing himself to his feet, Chang Mayang limps inside, eager to uncover what Jamon had guarded so carefully. Inside, he finds 3 shelves. The chamber isn't filled with treasures, as he might have hoped, but with documents and books. Approaching the first shelf, he pulls down a book and opens it, and his eyes widen. This ledger contains records of every property and asset Manhwa owns. With these documents, those deceitful merchants are now certainly doomed. But as he examines the rest of the vault, he notices that everything here seems to be financial records and ledgers. He'd expected to find something more tangible, like money or provisions. Curious, he reaches for a second book, noticing it's filled with martial techniques. Yet none of these forms are currently practiced at Manhwa. Chang Mayang realizes with a sense of awe that these techniques have been sealed away, hidden from disciples for generations. Jamon, who always struggled with the weight of his responsibilities, must have been too cautious to share these advanced techniques, fearing the burden they might place on the sect's younger members. In a way, the shelves reveal different facets of Jamon's character. The financial records represent his duty to the sect's stability, while the martial techniques reflect the compassion he felt, wanting to protect the younger disciples from hardship. Chang Mayang feels a surge of respect and understanding for Jamon's decisions. Now, however, Jamon's worries are over, for Chang Mayang is determined to rebuild Manhwa, restoring it to even greater heights than before. Just then, his eyes catch sight of a peculiar scroll resting on the 3rd shelf. Unrolling it, he finds a note addressed to the future sect leader. If you're reading this, it means the next leader has already been chosen. The sect leader may hold a title, but they do not decide Manhwa's fate. That responsibility belongs to the younger generation. The leader's role is simply to encourage them, to let Manhwa's spirit thrive through its disciples. Jamon's words continue, pleading with the new leader to release themselves from the idea that the sect's fate rests solely on their shoulders. Manhwa is a spirit, a force that remains unyielding, whether its future holds fortune or disaster. What will never change, even through millennia, is the duty to guide the disciples and to preserve our legacy. This is the burden I leave to you. Chang Mayang stands in silence, his fingers brushing the scroll's delicate paper. Chang Mayang carefully tucks the scroll away, shaking his head with a faint smirk as he thinks of Jamon's philosophical tendencies. However, he can't shake the feeling that something more should be in this vault. As he prepares to leave, his eyes linger on the odd arrangement of shelves in the room. Knowing Jamon's quirky obsession with asymmetry, like positioning lamps at strange angles, he finds it odd that one shelf is unusually empty. Curious, he leans against the shelf and pulls it upward, revealing a hidden compartment beneath it. A glow emanates from below, confirming his suspicion that there's another secret to uncover. Descending further, he finally discovers what he's been searching for. Piles upon piles of gold bars, rows of exquisite weapons hanging on the walls, precious gemstones and tomes filled with long-lost techniques. A grin spreads across his face as he marvels. Finally! Riches! Meanwhile, back at his quarters, the new leader of Manhwa sighs as he watches dawn break. While a new day should bring him hope, he feels only anxiety as he recalls the looming deadline. 5 days remain until Mongong's ultimatum. Just then, a voice urgently calls to him from outside. The leader rushes over, finding Unam standing there, looking more agitated than he's ever seen. "Come quickly," Unam exclaims. "You have to see this yourself to believe it." Sensing an emergency, the leader hurries after Unam, who leads him through the forest. Along the way, he notices a group of disciples collapsed in exhaustion, lying in a circle on the ground. Startled, he asks what happened. Unam gives a wry smile, explaining that the disciples volunteered for some new training. The scene shifts to Chang Mayang, resting under a tree, watching them all. The disciples call for him, asking where he's been. At that moment, he steps forward, looking worn but resolute. The sect leader, seeing him in this state, asks what happened. Chang Mayang brushes off the question. "Doesn't matter," he says, gesturing to the glowing chest he's brought along. "You might want to take a look at this." The leader steps closer, squinting until he's nearly blinded by the glint of gold and the gleam of documents stacked neatly inside the chest. Stunned, he sees the records of Manhwa's property holdings, the gold bars, and weapons. Chang Mayang explains he found it all by coincidence, though it's clear he's exhausted from the effort. When the leader questions how he managed it, Chang Mayang simply waves him off, saying he needs rest, and walks away. As the elder examines the chest's contents, he can barely believe his eyes. He hesitantly reaches for the documents, afraid they might be too delicate to handle. These records include the ownership of Manhwa's assets in Huan Prefecture. Realizing they are indeed the property records, he collapses to the floor in utter relief. A short while later, he awakens in bed, recalling the sight of the 7 blossoming blades technique records, wondering if he had dreamt it all. But a voice confirms it, and he realizes that the chest and its contents are very real. Soon after, Hayun Yong, Manhwa's head of finances, examines the documents. Confirming their authenticity, he notes that they include certificates from the government, making them indisputable. With these, Manhwa can reclaim the pavilion and its properties at any time. The leader breathes a deep sigh of relief, grateful for this turn of fortune. He marvels at how this mysterious child, Chang Mayang, seems to be a living charm for the sect, turning their misfortunes into blessings. However, he stands, resolute. "If these records are real," he says, "we have an urgent conversation to arrange." He immediately orders that the property owners listed in the records be summoned to Manhwa.
And those who don't like and subscribe, punish them.